The Australian Financial Review.
Slava Ukraina. Mr. President, please.
Last week, in only his second trip outside Ukraine since Russia invaded, Volodymyr Zelensky made a surprise visit to London.
Thank you so much.
Dressed in a military green sweatshirt and cargo pants, he gave a speech at Westminster Hall.
We know freedom will win. We know Russia will lose.
And presented a Ukrainian Air Force pilot's helmet to the Speaker of the House of Commons.
It's the helmet of a real Ukrainian pilot, and the writing on the helmet reads, "We have freedom, give us wings to protect it."
As the war approaches its first anniversary and Russia steps up its attacks, Zelensky's plea for fighter jets is just the latest test of the West's support for Ukraine. Welcome to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray. Today, the Australian Financial Review's Europe correspondent Hans van Leeuwen on what happens next in the war and where exactly lie Vladimir Putin's red lines. It's Thursday, February 16. Hans, Zelensky's been incredibly effective in galvanising support for Ukraine's war effort. This was the second trip he made. He went to Washington late last year. How important is this international engagement and what impact did his visit have in London, where you're based?
Oh, look, Lisa, Zelensky managed to wipe everything else off the front page during the maybe 24 hours he was on the ground in London.
And leaving a British Parliament 2 years ago, I thanked you for delicious English tea.
He got a huge reception.
And I will be leaving the Parliament today, thanking all of you in advance for powerful English planes.
He's incredibly well regarded in the UK. And when he was speaking at Westminster Hall to this packed assembly of MPs and baronesses and barons, you could have heard a pin drop.
God bless Great Britain and long live the King. Slava Ukraini.
He was so effective at what he was doing that, over the course of the time he was here, and it was only a day, you saw Prime Minister Rishi Sunak.
And Vladimir, your visit here today underlines our two countries.
Gradually, as the hours rolled by, loosen his language on what he was promising to Ukraine and upping his offer.
We must arm Ukraine in the short term, but we must bolster Ukraine for the long term. Your country cannot be left vulnerable to attack ever again. Today we have signed the London Declaration, further deepening our cooperation.
And it was such a good example of what Zelensky's biggest strength is as a war leader. He just understands the power of the soundbite. He knows how to craft an image, how to tell a story, how to create a narrative, and it has served his country so well. I've been covering this war mostly from London, and it's been an interesting place to be sat watching it unfold because the UK has been one of the most able and effective cheerleaders, I suppose you could say, for Ukraine, President Zelensky and the cause. One of the ways in which Britain has been working very closely with the Ukrainians is on training of troops.
Australian Defence Force soldiers will fly out of Darwin this week to provide training to Ukrainian troops.
70 ADF personnel will join those from Britain and New Zealand.
And the significance of this is that the Ukrainian army right now is really a reservist army. These are citizen soldiers. It's people who are giving up their day jobs to help fight for their country.
And there's now a 10-country mission going on down in the southwest of England in one of the UK's defence training facilities, which Australia has just become involved in. And in January, Australia sent a group of trainers over from Darwin who have now arrived and are helping what will end up being 10,000 Ukrainian recruits to learn the basics of battlefield. I mean, they're out there learning how to crawl through a minefield, learning how to take a Russian prisoner and make sure, a dead body isn't booby-trapped. A bunch of us Australian journalists here in London went down there when Defence Minister Richard Marles and Foreign Minister Penny Wong were in London and had a look at the training and spoke to some of the Ukrainians. And we were all incredibly moved, as were the ministers themselves, by the conversations we had with the Ukrainians there.
I came from Ukraine. Yes, I'm 46.
They were really just ordinary people.
We also have training with Australian instructors. Their experience, their experience is really helpful for us.
I spoke to a 46-year-old mother of a teenager who hadn't picked up a gun or imagined she'd be in this situation a year ago. And here she was, stomping through the mud to the sound of artillery fire, learning how to demine a field. And as we spoke, she tried to put on a brave face, but tears just jumped into her eyes so quickly.
Because I can't stay at home and do nothing. When our children die.
So the whole situation is so surreal. The war has just completely upended the country and the lives of everybody in it.
Hans, this time last year, many people, including Zelensky, were still insisting that Russia wouldn't invade, and other military experts predicted that if there was an invasion, it would be over in months, if not weeks. So how did we get to a point where British and Australian troops are training the ordinary people that you just talked about, not soldiers, in the English Hills before they go back to the front line in Ukraine?
In this sense, the war has followed a course that very few people predicted. I mean, it began with the fact that a lot of us thought this war wouldn't happen at all. I remember Alexander Downer, who's a columnist on our paper, writing a column probably only a few weeks before the war started, that was really quite convincingly set out why Putin, being the rational sort of schemer that he was, wouldn't do something as irrational and crazy as trying to invade and take over a country the size of Ukraine. When I spoke to him a little bit after the war started, he said, yeah, he'd misread the Russian leader. And I was like, so did I. And even Zelensky himself kept telling us that it wasn't really going to happen. But ultimately, we were proved wrong on February the 24th, when just around dawn, he announced it was happening, and in the troops went in great numbers and in very many locations. I was in Paris that week, actually, for a week of meetings with the French Foreign Ministry and the Élysée about the Indo-Pacific. And suddenly all we could talk about was Ukraine. And those conversations, particularly in a place like France, were very much along the lines of, wow, this could be over in a few weeks. The might of Russia is going to just roll through and take this place out. But the first big surprise of the war, I suppose, was that it didn't end quickly at all. We all expected that once Russia had made the decision to invade, that they would follow their usual playbook, which is to sort of, you start with a lot of bombing and you try and pound the place into submission. But they didn't do a shock and awe blitzkrieg on the civilian infrastructure. I mean, they did a lot of bombing, don't get me wrong, but they didn't really try to pound Ukraine into submission. And the going theory about that now is that Putin and the Kremlin assumed they were going to take Ukraine in a matter of weeks and then install a puppet government and run the place. And they didn't want to kind of completely destroy it if within a month or two at the best they were planning to be in charge of it. So there was a sort of hesitancy about taking out the country in that way. And the other sort of theory that people have is that the war actually not only took us by surprise, but it also took a lot of the Russian military by surprise. It was cooked up in the Kremlin among Putin and a very small number of advisors. And frankly, the military wasn't very well prepared, and they were told to rush in there. And vast columns of tanks are heading to Kiev, and the battle plans weren't properly thought out, and the military wasn't properly primed and ready. So that was the first big surprise. And as a result, the war started to drag on into the middle of the year and beyond. And meanwhile, of course, on the other side, we were equally surprised to find that while we'd been told sometimes that many Ukrainians were actually sort of pro-Russian and that Ukrainian society was divided and, Zelensky wasn't particularly popular, within weeks, Zelensky had rallied the people. The Ukrainians were all behind it. The morale was incredibly high. There was this extraordinary story of resilience coming out of Ukraine. And so it was clear that the Ukrainians were going to fight back and that they weren't going to take this lying down.
So the war has dragged on for almost 12 months now. It's hard to get accurate figures, but the estimates are that almost 200,000 Russian troops have died and more than 100,000 Ukrainians. You've talked about the initial Russian hesitancy and also Putin and the Russian troops' underestimation of Ukraine's capacity to resist. But what else led to this situation where both sides are locked in a protracted conflict?
I think what really surprised people was that although Russia has this extraordinarily large army, and every year you see it paraded up and down Red Square in the middle of Moscow, when it came to it, the tactics, the hardware, and even the personnel, it just wasn't all there. There was a series of sort of very grievous early strategic blunders in the way that Russia went about the war. They seemed to assume that it was going to be easy. They assumed the Ukrainians would either roll over or welcome them. And they deployed the wrong kinds of weapons in the wrong kinds of places. And I guess the other thing is that Russia assumed, and I think a lot of people in the West also assumed, that Ukraine was on its own and that the West would look at this conflict and think, oh, we don't want to get involved here. And initially in the West, there was that trepidation. And it felt like Britain and the US and the countries that really understand Russia that are on its borders, like the Baltic countries and Poland, really had to galvanize NATO. And so did Zelensky with his sort of relentless lobbying. But once that had happened, once NATO and the West were galvanized, and it became clear that the level of Western support gradually started to filter through into Ukraine in the form of weapons and money. And before you knew it, Ukraine had the West at its back and was able to sustain the conflict well beyond what anyone had expected when it started. And in the last year alone, the United States alone has provided something like $27 billion of security assistance, and the Europeans have been throwing money at it. And now we've kind of got to the point where, it doesn't look like the aim of the war is any longer to actually take over the whole of Ukraine or install a puppet government or overthrow Zelensky or any of these things. It's merely to just sort of try to find a way to win enough territory, just looking to kind of consolidate control of a few sort of somewhat Russian-speaking provinces to make it look like Putin has had success. But Lisa, a year into this war, where everyone thought Russia could potentially have won very quickly, we're now facing a potential stalemate. And both sides feel they need to act now to stop that stalemate from happening. So in the coming weeks, one side or both want to take decisive action that could change the course of the war. And some experts are saying that if there is going to be a big Russian offensive, it could even come on the date of the anniversary itself.
Russia has stepped up its attacks in the east of Ukraine amid fears of a new offensive by the Kremlin ahead of the first anniversary of its invasion of the country later this month.
But the stark reality tonight is that Russian attacks are already growing in intensity in the eastern Donbas area.
Urban warfare in Bakhmut. Russian forces pounded the city of Bakhmut on Monday in what NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg said was the beginning of a major, long-feared new offensive.
The reality is that we have seen the start already. Because we've seen what Russia does now, President Putin do now, is to send in thousands of more troops.
Hans, over the weekend, Russia launched its first aerial assault in weeks. And the latest report suggests that Putin has 2,000 tanks and 300,000 troops ready and waiting for a fresh offensive. But do you think that the anniversary really will be a trigger for an escalation in fighting?
I think looking at what the experts are saying, the answer to that question might be yes and no, in the sense that there already is a kind of escalation that's started over the most recent weekend. We saw a barrage of cruise missiles having another go at the energy grid. We're seeing a lot more fighting along the line in the Donbas region over in the east, where the two sides have got sort of stuck in a kind of almost World War I-esque trench warfare. The Russians have been driving forces forwards there along at least 5 different places in the last 3 or 4 days. There's been reports of a lot more shelling, a lot more kind of troop charges, a lot more missile attacks. None of it yet very successful. And in fact, some of it absolutely disastrous. There was an attack in Voleda where whole Russian units got wiped out. But it's clear that Russia is going to push forward those 300,000 troops that it's mobilized and try and make some decisive bid to get through those Ukrainian lines. And the reason is that the Russians know that the Ukrainians have got tanks coming and other weapons and more longer range missiles. And so the Russians need to make as much progress as possible before those things arrive and start to make their lives much more difficult. And so, Lisa, this has actually got Zelensky quite worried, because his fear is that Russia knows that the tanks aren't here yet and the training needs to take place and the weapons are still on the way and they need to move. And so Zelensky needs the weapons even more quickly, and he needs more of them even more quickly than they are coming. And so the reason why we saw him in Britain and in France and in Belgium, in Brussels this past week, was because he has to kind of up that tempo himself if he is to repel the Russian advance and then take a counter-offensive of his own in order to break the stalemate and create the sense of momentum that will help end this war. But the kind of no part of the question is, it doesn't look like Russia is planning to do any major new surprise thing at this stage, like come back through Belarus and try and take Kiev again, or kind of really up the tempo of missile strikes beyond what we've seen. It looks like this big offensive is going to be very much concentrated on the Donbass region, the areas that Putin has sort of claimed for Russia, the 4 provinces he has wanted to annex.
So there's been this ongoing debate in the West about how much military aid to give Ukraine. It's been going on since the start of the war. Britain said, interestingly, that it will consider Zelensky's request for fighter jets. The US has ruled that out for now, but they've provided Ukraine with the Patriot missile defence systems, which Zelensky has been asking for some time. Governments are making a risk calculation with each pledge to Ukraine about whether they are crossing a line that could cause the conflict to spiral out of control. Do you think that risk calculation is becoming harder as the war goes on?
Yeah, the red line keeps being blurred and keeps being pushed and keeps shifting, doesn't it? You know, ultimately, NATO doesn't want to fight a war with Russia. And so they want Ukraine to push back Russia, but they want Ukraine to do it. And it has to look like NATO is not involved. And it also has to look like Ukraine is fighting a kind of justified and defensive war, and not that Ukraine is fighting an offensive war, because that will give Russia the pretext to strike back in more aggressive and escalatory ways. So the fear that the West has is that there is some point, there is some moment where there is a genuine red line that can't be crossed, after which point Russia says, we are going to retaliate with the kind of force that Putin has muttered darkly about for months now. You know, there are sort of question marks over, is there really a circumstance in which Putin would resort to a nuclear weapon? Because the cost to him reputationally would be so great, even possibly among countries like China, who are supporting or at least not opposing him at the moment. And then whether actually a battlefield nuclear weapon would really achieve much in Ukraine, would it be a counterproductive move? But one of the big debates at the moment is about the kind of weapons that Ukraine is getting.
Today, I've announced that we in the UK will send an additional 6,000 missiles and provide £25 million in unrestricted funding for Ukraine's armed forces, more than doubling the lethal aid we've provided.
We will provide an additional 14 armoured personnel carriers, an additional 20 Bushmasters.
That the United States will be sending 31 Abrams tanks to Ukraine, the equivalent of 1 Ukrainian battalion.
The good news is that today we agreed within a group of different European countries to supply a large quota of Leopard 1 tanks.
The US has supplied the weapon system that was modified to reduce the range so that it couldn't reach inside Russian territory. And over the weekend, there were reports that the weaponry that the UK is supplying, the new long-range missiles, could be used to hit Crimea, which would be a real sort of punch in the gut for Putin and could potentially prompt a response. So these are the kind of risk calculations that they're taking. You know, what weaponry can the West give Ukraine that allows it to do the necessary things to push Russia back, but don't allow the war to escalate? So in a sense, where it's got to is the two sides are kind of almost like in a sailor's arm wrestle, but the West aren't able to give Ukraine the kind of support that would allow it to really sort of slam the Russian hand onto the table. And while Russia hasn't really yet demonstrated that it has the kind of resources and ability to sort of push Ukraine down. So at the moment, neither is really able to push the other beyond the point where it looks like a victor emerges.
Hans, let's talk about Russia and domestic support for its war in Ukraine. There's a period at the end of last year when Putin appeared to be vulnerable. There were a lot of stories written about the Russians who were unhappy with the mobilisation, and on the other hand, you had a sort of fairly loud chorus of criticism online about Russia's failures on the battlefield. There was even some speculation of regime change, but it seems to have passed. How firm is Putin's grip on power?
So, in the most recent polling, there's at least one place that does independent polling still in Russia called the Levada Center. And in their most recent poll, 53% of people still believe that the special military operation in Ukraine is proceeding successfully. There is still a sort of sense that it is patriotic to support the war. There's been reportedly quite a big exodus of unhappy Russians, so up to 700,000 people who have left the country, partly because they think the sanctions have, made it look unviable, or because there's just no sort of space to be a political opponent of the regime. And they've all sort of headed to Turkey and Georgia and Armenia and places like that. But in a way, that actually weakens the chance of, internal dissent gaining momentum, because so many people who might have been involved in it have kind of left the country. And then the other thing is, if you go on to sort of Twitter or, and you look at clips of the kinds of things that Russians are watching on television, you see sort of footage of grateful Ukrainians receiving aid from Russian troops. And you hear about Ukrainian atrocities and Ukrainian war crimes and corruption and human rights abuses. So in that sense, Putin, he doesn't really face a danger from some kind of, Maidan-style uprising of the sort that Ukraine itself had. His biggest danger really to him is that some of those around him may feel that he's lost his grip. He's not prosecuting a successful war. There's no way out. And ultimately, they will be questioning his fitness and competence for office. But even there are sort of military bloggers and ultra-right nationalists who have been criticising the conduct of the war, but not the aims of the war, but the conduct of the war. And that's really where his weak spot is he going to win this thing? Not, was it a good idea to do it? That ship has sailed, but is he going to win it?
Let's talk about Russia's economy as well, because Putin is being hit by economic sanctions. How much has that affected his ability to wage war in Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, when the sanctions first came in, and there was a sort of expectation that the Russian economy might sort of fall over, but in the end, it began to look like Russia was going to tough it out. The inflation is bad. The economy has shrunk by, estimates suggest, 5% at least. But it hasn't been an all-encompassing crisis that people are sort of feeling on the streets. But that economic hit is going to come and is coming. I mean, revenue from oil and gas has fallen in the past month quite dramatically, and government spending is still going up and up and up, particularly on defence. So you sort of feel like it's going to be a slow burn. The screws will turn, the economy will suffer. But at the moment, although there's been a massive slump in manufacturing output, there hasn't been sort of people feeling any more of a pinch than we are in the West. And in fact, if anything, you could argue that in Europe particularly, we're feeling it almost as much as they are, because the price of energy in Europe, the cost of living in Europe, the effect of that is almost as powerful as it has been in Russia so far. But, has it affected the resolve in the West to support Ukraine? No. And so has it affected the resolve of ordinary Russians and how they feel about the conflict? Possibly similarly, no. It's just a question of what the sanctions will hopefully achieve is, from Ukraine and the West's perspective, is that they will diminish the capacity of the Russian military machine to rebuild and sustain itself over the course of the coming year or 2 or 3 or 5, however long this conflict takes.
So running with your arm wrestle analogy, Hans, what happens next? What would it take for Ukraine to overpower Russia and win the arm wrestle? Or how could Russia force Ukraine to submit? How does this stalemate break?
It's a hard one to predict. We talked earlier about the many surprises the war's already delivered. There'll almost certainly be more of those. So it's a bit of a mug's game to get involved in forecasting it. But Ukraine's clear aim is not just to push Russia back to the boundaries that they had up until 24th of February last year. They've been fighting a 7-year war in the Donbass even before this started. 14,000 lives have already been lost before this war started. And Ukraine wants to resolve that issue by driving Russia out of the Donbass altogether. And in Ukraine's eyes, they also want to retake Crimea. So for them, this fight doesn't end until Russia is out of their territory and has no incentive or will or ability to come back in or regroup and re-threaten and destabilize again. That's a pretty tall order. So a Ukraine win really involves an enormous amount of extra Western supplied military firepower and capacity. And the question is, can the West continue to provide that? Does the West want to provide that? Because, basically for Ukraine to win, the war has to escalate. For Ukraine to push that arm down, the muscles have to get bigger and the force and the violence that Ukraine will need to use has to increase. And these are the things that the West is a little bit afraid of. For the Russians, they've probably changed their war aims for now. For the short to medium term, Russia is no longer looking to subjugate the entire of the Ukraine, depose Zelensky, install a puppet government in Kiev. Essentially, the war aim now is, in fact, the ostensible one that Putin supposedly started with, which is to take the Donbass region and 2 other provinces that are surrounded. And for him, if he could corner that territory, I think he could call the operation as it stands a success. And he could then negotiate from a position of strength. And he could potentially even make magnanimous concessions to Ukraine, like, oh, yes, you can join the EU if you want to. I mean, never NATO, but possibly the EU. And so it doesn't look like an impossible task for Putin to complete what he started. It just looks like it's going to be an incredibly expensive one, both in terms of human lives. I mean, there's a Ministry of Defence estimate just came out the other day saying that Russia's probably losing 800 people a day or 5,000 people a week on the front line, which is a phenomenal rate and completely unsustainable. And it feels like unless this offensive is quite spectacular in some way, we may end up just seeing this grinding stalemate go on for months and possibly all year. I mean, at the moment, neither side has any reason to negotiate. They're still looking to kind of gain battlefield advantage that they can take to the table and force the other side to compromise on. And unfortunately, for either side to gain that battlefield advantage, an extraordinary amount of violence and needless death is yet to come. So I think what we're looking at is the side that loses this war is the one that realises, or is forced to realise, that it no longer has the resources or the energy to finish the job.
Thanks, Hans.
Thanks, Lisa.
Here's the other big stories we're covering this week. Reserve Bank Governor Philip Lowe has defended his board's decision to lift interest rates 9 times since May, telling a Senate committee he recognises those increases were unpopular, but that they were necessary for him to do his job of controlling inflation. Lowe also told the hearing there was nothing untoward about his attendance at a private lunch hosted by investment bank Barrenjoey last week, and insisted he would serve out his 7-year term, which is due to end in September. And Nikki Haley, who came to prominence as UN ambassador during the Trump administration, has entered the race for US president. The 51-year-old, who was the first Indian American in a presidential cabinet, is currently the only Republican challenger to Donald Trump. She has called for generational change in her party ahead of the 2024 election. Thank you for listening to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray, with Hans van Leeuwen reporting today. The Fin is produced by Alex Gow and Lap Fan. Fiona Buffini is the executive producer. Our theme is by Alex Gow. If you like the show and want to hear more, follow us wherever you get your podcasts and consider rating and reviewing us as it helps others find us. For more stories about markets, business and power, subscribe to The Financial Review at afr.com/subscribe. See you next week.
The Australian Financial Review.